afternoon. Welcome to TNC Radio.live. This is the Truckers Network Radio Show. And now here's your host, Shelley Johnson.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Yes, this is the Truckers Network Radio Show on TNCRadio.live, where we offer the news, weather, traffic, information, and entertainment our drivers want and need. Drivers may have heard about the FMC announcement on chassis of choice at the ports. Here's what's happened. The Intermodal Motor Carrier Conference has established that the Federal Maritime Commission now has jurisdiction over this matter and that exclusive chassis agreements violate the Shipping Act when the motor carrier is not able to use the chassis provider of choice. All of this is important news. It's kind of confusing, and we wanted to learn more about what has changed and what's going on. So we invited Donna Lem and Jim Gillis of IMC Companies, the nation's largest marine drayage company, to talk about this. Donna is Chief Commercial Officer for IMC. Jim is President of Pacific Drayage Services. Welcome, Donna and Jim. Thank you for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Shelley.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I really appreciate it. All of this sounds a bit complicated. I guess I wanted to give our listeners some background. What's been happening, and what does the recent decision and change mean to carriers?
So, Shelley, I'll start. I think that our drivers who are moving international marine equipment could probably tell this story much better than I can. What has been happening for over a decade is that our drivers have had to use a specific chassis when pulling out of a marine terminal or a rail terminal. And I say that I'm talking specifically about wheeled operations or partially wheeled operations. And the frustration came and perhaps was heightened during COVID. Chassis, obviously this metal frame with wheels is critical. And what's important to start out with is that we're the only country in the world that doesn't allow our wheels to stay with our drivers, right? So what happened was, this has been going on for a long time. There were many motor carriers who worked very hard to educate how these restrictions were harmful to our drivers' ability to go in and out of terminals. And what it came to was the need for the ATA, this IMC group, to file a claim against OCEMA. Basically what happened, the FMC did acknowledge jurisdiction over this, took the claim, and just about 3 weeks ago, the announcement was made by the administrative law judge prohibiting or basically saying that these restrictions on both door moves or CY moves, we'll just call it carrier haulage and merchant haulage, were against and in violation of the Shipping Act. Translation, unreasonable practices. And so this is where we are today. The bigger question that you're asking, what does it mean? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a very strong likelihood that this may be challenged, but we've already seen some significant movement by the powerhouses, one being the UP Railroad. Announcement just last week that their Global 4 terminal in Chicago would go to a stacked operation, meaning historically when that train arrived, the train would immediately mount those international boxes coming in on chassis. For our drivers, yes, we all like the fluidity. We like the ability to move when something's already wheeled. But as we all know, these trains are getting longer. The volume has increased dramatically. The ability to scale becomes front and center. And so they are stacking. Why? Because the chassis just weren't there these past couple of years. And because they weren't there, they became buried and something called storage charges mounted. And so what we saw with this UP announcement last week, immediately, I guess, recognizing that things had to change. Our world has changed. Our terminals have changed. The volume that we manage day to day has changed. And so I'll start with that is probably one of the first big things that has moved the needle, probably in 10 years, but that happened just a week ago. Jim, do you see any movement yet on the West Coast on this announcement, or do you think it's too soon?
I think it is a little bit too soon to really see the impact, but from the truckers that I'm talking to, we're pretty excited because choice brings in an element of trucker controlling the chassis. We as a large private company, we've got a ton of chassis on the road, brand new. We feel that providing a driver with a great piece of equipment improves his experience. If you go back to the olden days of the way railroad operations happened, they would pre-mount those boxes, but oftentimes the driver would go to pick up the box. He would have to go into a chassis repair line to get a repair done in that chassis. And in our case, we want to go in there with a brand new piece of equipment that we control, that we've been taking care of, and improve that driver's experience on the road.
That makes so much more sense. I would think that companies wouldn't want to do it any other way because they have liability if something isn't mechanically sound, right?
Absolutely. And if you go to Europe, that's what you see. The truckers control the chassis. They don't really separate the chassis from the container on a movement. It's you provide the driver and a chassis and you pick up a container. And hopefully before too long, that's the way the United States will flow.
How did this evolve this way in the United States? I find it really complicated.
So I'll take that one. So let's take it back to the beginning of even containerization, right? Malcolm McLean, and I am a past Sealander, but it goes way back, right? Where Malcolm McLean believed that the wheels should stay with the container. And he started containerization here in the US. Well, our ports and our terminals were wide open, and they could accommodate these wheeled units. And then in the late 80s and 90s, when we saw basically double stack trains starting and initiated, the practice of a wheeled operation continued. And it was a natural then for our railroads to receive these incoming trains and do exactly what they did in our port gateways. They put the containers on wheels when the train arrived. Ocean carriers were responsible for both the chassis, and they were also responsible, of course, for their equipment and the through movement of that international box. What happened sometime around 2009 and 10, there was, to your point, a Safety Act. There was lots of concern about insurance, about liability. There was this big movement for ocean carriers to get out of the chassis business. And I believe back in 2010, I would imagine that ocean carriers really did believe they wanted to get out of this business of chassis provisioning. But what happened, there is a lot of shipments that move on a door basis, which means that the carrier is ultimately responsible for the movement to the door. And what did we just talk about? Our drivers need to stay with the wheels. And so the ocean carriers came right back, leasing back this equipment for all these moves that were moving to these wheeled operations. Because of the complexity, and it's what you said, Shelley, this is so confusing. What happened was the industry kind of moved along with ocean carriers choosing and contracting and making agreements with chassis providers to serve their business. But what also began happening was this movement away from door to almost 70% of the shipments moving what we call on a merchant haulage or CY move. Translation, the driver, that trucker, and that shipper is responsible for the move. The argument's simple. Whoever's going to pay for that move should be in control of that move. They should be able to choose which chassis they use. To Jim's point, our drivers want safe, equipment, our drivers want the freedom and the flexibility to keep those wheels with them in and out of terminals. And so this is how it happened. It happened so fast in 2010, as one by one ocean carriers began getting out of the business and then immediately coming back in. And for the unsuspecting shipper, my goodness, they've always had chassis. So it was never a question for us as motor carriers. As we all know, we are the eyes and ears of our industry. And so way back then, in 2012, there were a group of motor carriers who came together and said, look, we believe, as the ocean carriers do, an interoperable gray pool. One, chassis are a utility. Let us pool these so they're interoperable. So the system, all of our motor carriers will always have a chassis at their disposal when they come into either a marine terminal or into a rail terminal. And so while that may have worked, we've rocked along as an industry. But like all good things, there are weather concerns, there are perhaps peaks and valleys. And as we saw shortages of equipment, we began to raise issue in 18, 19, well before pre-COVID, that our model no longer fit the industry. We have changed. The big ships got bigger. Our trains got longer. And our motor carrier base, as we know, can only handle so much freight. And so this is how this thing came to a head. I mean, Jim, this is how I see it. I've been doing this for about 30 years in the industry, but for you, you may have a different perspective. I wonder what you see.
No, I agree with you. I always hone in on the driver experience element, which we talked about, and as well as safety. When I'm running down the road with one of our drivers, I want to make sure, I want to know that chassis has been inspected on a regular schedule by my team, and we've been taking care of the chassis. And so I really kind of emphasize the safety element of this versus the old model. So I'm a big believer and fan of what's happening right now in our industry.
And Shelley, another thing that we experience in the interior of the United States, we believe that over 30% of our drivers' time is chasing these old restrictions, chasing the right color chassis.
Yep.
These chassis are never in the right place at the right time.
I
And this
bet.
is why we think it's such a huge win for our drivers.
Sure.
If we can take these restrictions off and allow our drivers to go in and out of these terminals, the right thing.
That would make total sense. It's got to save money, certainly save on frustration, because the frustration level has to be just astronomical.
It is. I mean, Jim, how many times does a driver go to a railroad to get just that right color chassis and they're not there?
Absolutely. A driver is paid to drive. That's what they want to do. That's their chosen profession. And it's not to sit in a chassis pit yard waiting for the correct color chassis to arrive. And so, Donna's right. The amount of time that is wasted is just hugely inefficient for these drivers to sit around and scour a yard for chassis.
I have I'm just so grateful to be able to drive with our drivers. I think that's the only way to really understand, one, our business, and two, to share the driver's experience and be able to communicate that back to anybody who'll listen. And I don't care if it's Congress, I don't care if it's, our family and our friends. Everybody has to understand our driver's experience. I remember going into one of our railroads, Jim, and we drove around for 45 minutes looking for the right chassis, how many had flat tires, how many were tagged or not tagged, right, in poor condition. And then we had to leave because we couldn't find the right piece of equipment. We had to travel to the railroad across the river to find the right piece of equipment.
Jeez.
Yeah.
A lot of frustration and a lot of wasted time, and nobody was getting paid.
This had to have made the backup at the ports a whole lot worse when you think about it. all of this chasing around, wasting time doing this to get the right chassis instead of having one available to keep things flowing.
You're exactly right. And that's the message that we kept saying. I mean, look, we're not going to blame everything on the lack of supply of chassis. God knows we had a lot of other things going on. But if we could do one thing, just one thing that would enhance our ability for our drivers to go in and out, it would be this chassis discussion. And that's why we work so hard to make sure that we would unleash this restriction. And so we're just delighted that we get to be able to share the news. I think the driver experience on this really needs to be told, because often that experience is buried. Just go get my freight. The understanding of what it takes to go get that freight, that's the critical piece.
We're making things a lot easier for drivers, and that is huge because we want to keep them happy too. And when you're busy chasing things around, dealing with frustration or waiting, they do plenty of that. They do enough of it in the docks and everything else. They don't need to be chasing down a chassis. Makes sense.
So right. And I'm smiling, we have happy drivers. That's what we need to do. Right. And that's our job. This thing took on such national light. I mean, even General Lyons, our port envoys, really trying to understand this chassis situation, right? Trying to bring teams together from all over the country to understand what can we do.
Yeah.
And so this is just a great thing. And we are, as Jim said, we are huge fans, waving the flag for chassis choice.
I think it's terrific. Sounds like a win-win to me. We do have to go to break here for a commercial. I certainly want to discuss more of this and maybe some other things regarding trucking. This would be terrific, and shipping. I'm speaking with Donna Lem and Jim Gillis of IMC Companies. We've been talking about chassis of choice. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. The Truckers Network helps professional drivers save money and makes their lives easier. We were created for drivers by a commercial driver. We know the industry and driver needs. A Truckers Network membership offers exclusive discounts through our trusted partners on things like truck care, truck parking, tires, oil changes, fuel additives, fitness, roadside assistance, first aid kits, driver training, and a whole lot more. Start saving today. Check us out at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. That's app.thetruckersnetwork.net. The trucking industry keeps America running thanks to the 3.36 million professional truck drivers who deliver everyday goods to 80% of American communities who rely on trucking for that last mile. The industry represents a diverse group with nearly half of drivers at 42% as minorities. Trucking Moves America Forward, or TMAF, educates the public on the essentiality of trucking by telling the story of trucking and its positive impact on our economy, communities, and lives. Learn how you can join the industry movement by visiting truckingmovesamerica.com. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm speaking with Donna Lem and Jim Gillis of IMC Companies about drayage and shipping at the ports, and the biggest issue now about the decision about chassis of choice. So, Donna and Jim, do you think the chassis of choice decision is going to be challenged? Where do you see us headed going forward?
So I'm pretty certain that this will likely be challenged. This is a huge issue for all stakeholders. I think we've got about 7 days left before we see any formal announcement of a challenge. But what we absolutely need to do is to get the message out there why chassis choice is so significant, why it's so immediately needed by our drivers, and we need to get that message out now. And so we're so happy to even have this chance to share this with our driver community, that for the first time there has been an ALJ or a ruling that says we acknowledge that what's been going on is so unreasonable, so unfair to the motor carrier community. And so I believe that we will likely see a challenge. The question is, how long will it take, I guess, to go through all of this? I can't answer some of those questions, but I do and encouraged by some of the recent activity by the UP Railroad acknowledging, basically that things had to change. And so moving from this wheeled operation in Chicago that is huge to a stacked operation also coming out and announcing they will no longer look to cherry picking. They will no longer, prohibit private use of chassis in and out. And I certainly believe that this is tied to this, this pretty big happening, this pretty big and exciting ruling for chassis choice. Jim, anything that you see?
Change is hard. And, to change the way an industry has operated for so many years is not an easy task. I think that the boulder is halfway up the mountain. I agree with Donna. There certainly is going to be a challenge forthcoming, but I feel that, the messaging is on point. We're in this to improve the lives of our drivers and to improve the safety. And so I think ultimately we're going to be successful.
It seems to make sense to me. Who's going to be challenging this? I mean, I'm sure that there's somebody who is losing with this decision. Who do you see
really
challenging
interesting point. Who's going to be challenging OCEMA? It's the Ocean Carrier Equipment Management arm of the ocean carrier community that serves the United States. Basically, it is that group that will likely be challenging. But what's so fascinating, Shelley? We served on teams, and as I said, like all good things, wouldn't it be beautiful if we could just talk and commercially move the needle, and do what is in the best interest of all stakeholders. I believe, and there were many stakeholders, and frankly, even ocean carriers who said, we believe things must change. We believe that chassis provisioning models are broken. I've got to believe for some ocean carriers, understanding even chassis provisioning, they're in the business of moving ships, right? Trains are in the business of moving trains. People want to stay in their core.
Sure.
And so perhaps in all of that, the real complexity and the hardships that were created by these restrictions were so misunderstood. And it was, a big issue like the congestion that COVID brought on that made this issue front and center.
Oh, yeah.
I am hopeful that there are ocean carriers, and there are those out there that did allow choice. I think we must share that not all ocean carriers prohibited and had exclusive usage agreements. There were those that understood the need for the freedom to go in and out of a terminal. There were those that had grounded facilities that allowed private use of chassis to go in and out. Let me give you an example of what happened in the interior of the United States, a place like Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas has two of our major Western railroads are wheeled operations in Dallas. One partially wheeled, one totally wheeled, meaning what? When the train arrives, they have to be placed on chassis. Today, if you ask me how many private chassis do you have in the Dallas market, that will give you an indication of the ability and the freedom to go in and out with your own wheels if you're a driver. I'm going to tell you it's likely less than 3% of the market.
Okay.
That's a problem. It's a problem, one, because why wouldn't a trucker, somebody like IMC, invest in chassis in the Dallas market? We want to. We want to give that driver that new chassis that Jim's talking about. We need to know the age and the standards are all being met with radial tires, and that our drivers are in good shape. When you have a wheel facility like that, and the ocean carriers have already predetermined usage of chassis, You don't get a vote in that.
No, you don't.
And I think, for me, and sometimes we've talked about it so long for years, trying to educate, the biggest aha moment for me was when I was asked the simple question, well, how many private chassis do you think you have in that Dallas market? And I said, maybe 3 to 4%.
Wow.
And that's a wow. And I think
Mhm.
that's a pretty strong indicator of what's going on here. That's been maybe quieted, maybe for a million different reasons, but quieted for so long.
Well, it just makes sense to me. And I would think that there's going to be a huge benefit to the carriers because they can save on insurance. There's going to be less liability if you know the quality and the mechanical soundness, if you will, of that chassis. You know where it's coming from versus something you're just picking up. That's going to be a cost savings. That's going to be passed on to the consumer down the road, too. And it isn't just convenience for the driver, which is huge, too.
I think the issue too, I agree with you. And I think the hardship becomes in forecasting.
Mhm.
What does that look like? And you add any kink in the system, right? The
Yeah.
forecast that you had and all the best analytics go to the side. And so the ability to have a market and a system that can support their own shipments, their own movements. You ask Jim, as truckers, we are managing and looking forward. We're constantly looking at what that vessel has. What does our order look like? What does our driver count need to look like when that vessel arrives? What does that train look like? We're tracking and tracing the trains as they come in from the east and in from the west. And when that train arrives, we know that we have a voice. We can put, for our shippers, we can put our own wheels in that facility to retrieve any of that freight that we have, control over, that our shippers and ourselves are paying for. It's a pretty good deal.
Mhm. Do you see an increase in business for chassis manufacturers, too?
We see a huge demand for chassis manufacturers.
Mhm.
I mean, the demand for chassis has been front and center, since COVID, right? There just
Right.
wasn't enough supply. There
Mhm.
were issues even in China and tariffs and the complexity of adding cost and limiting supply in a period of time when there was such a great need. And that's what we were saying. For goodness sakes, take the restrictions off. We've got limited supply. Let us best utilize what we have.
Sure. Let the people who know supplies, logistics, drayage, shipping, let them handle it because they
Amen.
can get the things moving and work the kinks
Amen.
out. Yeah.
So Jim's been buying up a bunch of chassis. Maybe you can share what that demand looks like and what you see.
Well, demand is high on chassis. If you talk to any of the chassis manufacturers, right now they're looking at third and fourth quarter delivery. A couple of points too, that the chassis age that we saw in some of the pools, especially the interior, in some cases, our drivers are going into terminals and using these forced chassis that are 20 plus years old.
I.
And to me,
Ooh.
that's just crazy,
Oh,
right? And
yeah.
so I think that you're going to see a big movement towards modernization of the chassis fleets, and they do refurbs and they do a great job at improving some of the componentry of these chassis. But ultimately, I don't want my driver running down the road with a piece of equipment that's 25 years old.
No.
And Shelley, I would say one other comment. You were talking about consumer cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so to us, if you look over the last couple of years, the inefficiencies of the supply chain that were laid bare by the pandemic and this certain rush of folks buying, you've seen this increase of inflation, and a lot of it was borne by the inefficiencies of the supply chain. So I think that, as we modernize the fleet and we improve the driver experience and we get these drivers moving in and out of the terminals a little bit quicker, the consumer will benefit over a period of time as costs lower in the supply chain.
I love that, Jim. Shelley,
Yeah.
I just like to add, I mean, we started tracking some of the escalation of costs for our shippers. And so in one of our markets, for example, the cost for them and one of the terrible, things that happened was this thing called demurrage and storage, right? And so these demerge costs are borne when something is on a container is on a terminal, or storage when a container is on a railroad and can't be picked up. And there was a terrible misunderstanding. I know that many of our rails just felt like, my gosh, people are using our space for storage. I promise you, there were so many of our shippers who just wanted their freight, but
Sure.
couldn't get it.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have access to wheels, chassis, to
Mhm.
go pick up their freight. So I agree with Jim on all fronts. I think that the consumer will certainly benefit from this ability and flexibility that they otherwise would not have had to go in and retrieve their freight on their trucker's chassis.
This is going to eliminate gridlock, and people are going to get their stuff sooner. That's a win-win.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you have to wonder and scratch your head, why did it take this long? It seems so logical, right?
I often say that it's so true. The answer's right there in front of your nose.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it take this long? Maybe because chassis were taken for granted. People just assume that, if you've got a truck, you've got wheels too. And
I don't think the average person knows how any of this works. They just think, oh, it's a trailer. It comes on wheels. No, you've got a container. You have to have a chassis. Things have to have wheels. They don't come on wheels
yeah,
across the ocean.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Or on the train. Yeah, people don't think about that. They just see the end result.
right. I mean, it's what we say all the time. Where's my freight?
Yeah, where's my stuff?
Yeah.
And the problem is, I think a lot of people making the rules don't understand how all of it works either.
Yeah. I want to go back to Jim's comment on safety. When we first started to try and share this huge concern of chassis provisioning and how our models are antiquated, need to be changed, updated, modernized, real, serving, our supply chain. I was driving with one of our drivers. He had 6 kids, and it was June. And it was probably 98 degrees in Memphis, Tennessee, right? And he looks at me, and this is this experience I'm telling you about, that we look for 45 minutes for the right color chassis.
Ugh.
And the driver gets out and has to inspect the chassis to make sure that it's roadworthy and ready to go.
Mm.
And he said, I want you to come over here. I want you to look at these tires. He said, how do you think I feel at 98-degree weather? And I'm driving on with these tires.
Mm. Yeah, that's a major problem that hopefully this will eliminate. People want safety. I mean, they're screaming about it all the time. That's how you get it. It seems like this is a step in the right direction, and let's hope any challenges are rebuffed to reverse this. Yeah. Well, I appreciate all of this information. We do have to go to another break here. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with Donna Lem and Jim Gillis of IMC Companies. They're explaining the chassis of choice, what's going to be happening down the road. This is super helpful. Stay tuned for more great information right here on tncradio.live. TNCRadio.live is proud to carry the Steve Summers Overnight Drive Show. TNCRadio.live is dedicated to commercial drivers. We offer the news, traffic, and weather you need, and the entertainment, sports, talk, music, and celebrity interviews you want to hear 24/7. We have original shows and trucker podcasts that feature some of your favorites, like Ice Road Alex Debogorski and America's Truckin' Sweetheart Marcia Campbell. TNCRadio.live is convenient and designed for professional drivers. The best part is we're free, and you can listen anywhere you are on the road. With just one tap, you can tune into Steve Summers and us right on your phone. Simply download our app by going to app.tncradio.live. That's app.tncradio.live. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm your host, Shelley Johnson. I've been talking with Donna Lem and Jim Gillis of IMC Companies about the change with chassis of choice. It's a great change that all drivers and carriers can definitely get behind. In our next segment here, I thought I'd switch gears, pun intended, to talk briefly about sustainability. Jim, you said you have information on that.
Sure. We as a company, we've invested pretty heavily over the last year as an early adopter in the electronic market in California. Truly, California is innovating through regulation, and unfortunately, the technology isn't there yet, but it is rapidly approaching. And so we're pretty proud of our position. We're trying out different technology, whether it's an electric truck or a fuel cell vehicle. And we feel that, over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, that it's going to catch up, right? And our internal goal, and at least in California, is by the year 2027, we will have replaced all of our diesel trucks and to a complete zero emissions front in California.
How is that going to work? Because I know there's a lot of nervousness about it.
There's a tremendous amount of nervousness, and count me as one of those folks, right? What it's caused us to do is really rethink the whole road supply chain. A typical customer that we've got in the Inland Empire out of the Port of LA, we're going to have to rethink how we deliver his cargo because of the limitations of electric trucks in today's world, right? So hopefully in the next couple of years that'll speed up, and we'll start getting a much better efficiency on those trucks, and we'll get a little bit better range on them. But in today's world, you've got a fairly limited range. And so the other big concern that I think you'll find for most folks in California is the demand on the infrastructure, right? So our electrical grid in California is not the best. And when you're talking about replacing 20, 30, 40,000 trucks with electric vehicles in the next 8 years, that's going to be a tremendous strain on the electrical grid.
That's a really short window.
It is. And actually the shortest window that we've got is as of next January, as the legislation currently stands, a trucker will no longer be able to add in a diesel vehicle to the port drayage truck registry. And so the worry is that we've probably gone a little bit too fast in this quest for zero emissions. Certainly there's a need for it. We've got, heavy populated areas. We've got a tremendous amount of pollution on these areas. And so we've got to do better. But the question, the hard question to ask is it too fast? Are we trying to regulate a little bit too fast before the innovation with this new technology arrives?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of concerns there. I've heard concerns too, say there's a massive power outage, because that can happen. You can have an earthquake, especially in California. They're more prone to that. Natural disasters that interrupt electric. So you can't get charged at charging stations. What happens? You still have to move freight. And certainly in those cases, you need to be able to move in goods to help people, medical supplies and food. Would diesel trucks be allowed at that point, or would it still be the electric?
That's a great question, and one that I sure hope our legislators really ponder carefully. What I would say is, what we saw this past summer when our governor came out and declared that 2030 would be the end of gas vehicles. Immediately thereafter, we had some power problems in California, and charging of electric vehicles wasn't allowed between the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Right. So it was a little funny to those of us that were, in the middle of purchasing electric vehicles. So, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is there. I'm hoping that there's some federal funding that is going to come and help improve the overall grid infrastructure. And I think that they need to devote a significant amount of money before we really take this leap off the platform.
Yeah, because I think a lot of states are looking at California to see how this all works.
Yep.
And to see if it works. Now, isn't it true that the electric vehicles with all those batteries, they're a lot heavier, aren't they?
They are, and that's a great point. So in today's world, a typical day cab diesel tractor that we run in Southern Cal is about 15,500 pounds. A new Volvo electric truck is about 25,500 pounds. So that 10,000 pound difference may not seem like a lot, And certainly there are allowances. We get an extra 2,000 pounds in California to run at 82,000 GVW. But when you're talking about export loaders, right? Every additional pound is more money for them on their bottom line. And so I think that to me is one of my biggest concerns is, how do I go and sell to a shipper that's in the Central Valley that it's traditionally shipping 43 to 40,000, 44,000 pounds of cargo. And now because of this electrical truck requirement, now they're going to have to go down to 37, 38,000 pounds.
That's a hard sell. Yeah.
It is. It certainly is.
Well, I'll add something here. We work very closely with our ag community and move a tremendous amount of ag, and Jim's 100% right. Every pound ounce counts to that ag exporter because the value of the product, of course, the FOB value of the goods is limited, right? And so there's very small margin. And so, Jim, I see this as being a huge issue for all ag all over the country, because 10,000 pounds is the difference of let's just say our cotton friends, for example, when a bale of cotton weighs 500 pounds, and the inability, for 20 bales to be left behind, that's huge.
It is.
Because they sell based on weight. It's going to be very, very interesting dynamic.
In the case of produce, you don't want to leave that behind for very long because it's going to rot.
You are so right. You are so right. Perishables only have X amount of shelf life, right?
Yeah. So if you have a power outage, of course, I'm playing the devil's advocate here. You have a power outage and things can't move. All of a sudden, you've got a lot of stuff that isn't getting shipped, and farmers they're out money. Yeah. So there are a lot. I'm hoping everybody's looking at all of those different scenarios, because Mother Nature will give us scenarios whether we like them or not.
I'm betting on technology, and I'm betting on, I guess, just between now and maybe, Jim, I don't think it's going to make January 24, but let's just say over the next couple of years, these batteries become lighter. I guess I'm betting that they will figure this weight issue out.
Yeah, I mean, you got to compare it to the cell phone, right? So, back in the 80s when cell phone first came out, there were these big, huge bricks. And then they migrated to a very small piece of equipment that you put in your pocket. So over a period of time, we're going to get smarter about batteries, how we manufacture. And so, the true weight on these trucks is truly the battery, right? And so to extend the range, they've got to add more batteries. And then I'd also tell you, there's more technology than just electric out there, right? So you've got, Nikola has just put out a pretty cool fuel cell vehicle powered by hydrogen, and at the same weight, 25,000 pounds, but it's got a stated range of 500 miles. And so I think that there's a race to really put out a good usable product. And I think the OEMs are really starting to listen a little bit to what our needs are.
I'm going to throw this out there. Is it possible to convert diesel engine to hydrogen or not?
Not that I've heard of. There's a group out of Austin that's doing some interesting things where they're taking a diesel body, they can remove the engine, and they put in a CNG, LNG power plant that's backed up by electric. And I think that's fairly interesting. Unfortunately, in the state of California, CNG, LNG aren't considered zero emissions. And that's the regulation that we're probably most concerned about, is we're going from, a standard emissions protocol to zero. And that's a fast transition. And you almost want to stair step it down, because CNG, LNG are tried and true, and they're in operation around the country and very successful.
I think I've seen, if I'm not mistaken, aren't some of the Postal Service trucks running on LG?
Absolutely are. They sure are.
So, I mean, it's something that's been done before, and it seems like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Try this too, because at least we know it can be done.
Yeah, and the other point to consider is there's certainly no shortage of CNG natural gas in the United States. I mean, we're a very large exporter of natural gas, and so to me, why not use the resources you have to power your trucks?
Mm-hmm. You need to go and talk in front of the legislature, give a good lecture.
Absolutely.
You're making sense here. This has been very interesting. I really do appreciate all of your information, Donna and Jim, about the chassis of choice. I would say that that's a hurrah. I see things moving much better, and the wheels don't need to be greased. They're just going to do what they need to do so we can get things rolling with the chassis of choice. And it will be interesting to see what happens with sustainability in California. A lot of people are going, you got the skeptics going, I don't think it's going to work this way, but I wanted to have your take on that. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Well, we thank you so much,
Thank you.
just to be able to share our enthusiasm and our support for chassis choice. We're really excited to see this needle finally moving, and defer to Jim, our expert, on our initiatives out here, and very grateful to him for all that he's doing in this very important area.
Yes, it's wonderful. Now, where can people find your company? What is your website?
So our website is www.imcc.com. We invite everybody to our website to learn more about us. You'll be able to learn more about Jim. What we just recently announced, really big news. Jim works for, well, I'll let you, Jim, you share where you work and how they'll be able to find us in just a little bit all together.
So absolutely. So in today's environment, IMC Companies is comprised of 8 different operating companies. And so what we've just announced is that we're going to unify as one brand called IMC. And so it'll probably take us several months to get there. But, before the end of the year, everybody in our network will be considered an IMC employee.
Wonderful. For those who aren't familiar, I'm sure most people are, but for those who aren't, what does IMC do?
So
We specialize, I'm sorry, Donna.
Oh, no, I'm just so excited. IMC is the largest drayage provider in the United States, and our core competency is drayage and terminals. And so, Jim, maybe you share a little bit about what the great stuff you're doing out here in LA.
Yeah, so as Donna said, we really focus on international container. We also do transloading, warehousing on both coasts. We're getting into the domestic market a little bit. So our goal is to be a single source solution for our customers.
Wonderful. Well, I would dare say you folks are absolute experts, and you've been at it for a long time. I was looking at your website, and you're experts in all of this, and you've been super informative, letting us know what's happening with chassis of choice, as well as some of the sustainability initiatives going on in California. I appreciate you being on the show here. This has been terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We love being with you all today.
Yes, this has been very informative. You've been listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. Be sure to stay tuned for more great programming. We've got some primetime lineups with some great information, great entertainment coming up right here on tncradio.live. Thank you for listening to another great interview on tncradio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on tncradio.live, on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of tncradio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast of the Truckers Network radio show.